Have you ever wondered what it's like to work in law enforcement? Here on Behind the Star, we share stories about the Orange County Sheriff's Office, Central Florida's largest law enforcement agency. From forensics to dispatch to the deputies on patrol, we'll talk to the brave men and women who protect our community. This is Behind the Star, the official podcast of the Orange County Sheriff's Office. Welcome to Behind the Star, the official podcast of the Orange County Sheriff's Office. My name is Jon Busdeker, your host here at Behind the Star, and we have a fascinating episode of Behind the Star today about a recent cold case solved by the OCSO cold case team. Now, it's been a while since we had a cold case featured on Behind the Star, so if you watch our Facebook, if you watch our social media, you may have seen last week, Sheriff John Mina announced the arrest of Ronald Cates in the murder of Jon Stagner. Jon Stagner was an Orange County maintenance worker who was brutally attacked and killed in his home in 1992. Now, Ronald Cates was a person of interest at the time, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. Earlier this month, Cates, who lives in North Carolina, was arrested. Now, I have Corporal Dave Nutting and Detective Kevin Wilson of the cold case team here with me to explain exactly how the Sheriff's Office solved this case. Welcome to Behind the Star.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
We had a press conference with the sheriff and you two, and we announced this cold case. And so we're going to sort of walk through it. We talked about it. It's been in the news. This is about the murder of Jon Stagner, who was murdered in 1992 here in Orange County. And we had, like I said, this recent sort of break in the case. And so I wanted to bring you guys in here to talk a little bit more about it. So why don't we start? We'll start back at the beginning. Let's go back 30 years ago. Tell me, who was Jon Stagner? I'll have Detective Wilson. Why don't you start?
Okay, so Jon Stagner was a very, very hardworking man. He lived at home with his wife and his wife's mother. Back in 1992, he was actually an Orange County maintenance worker. So his residence was actually on the Orange County property. They did various odds and ends types of work. They would get called out to in the middle of the night for like a tree down in the roadway, and they'd have to clear the road. They'd do other things within the maintenance aspect for the Orange County, area.
And this was on the east side of Orange County, if I'm not mistaken.
Where it actually happened, off of Forsyth Road, yes, sir. But John was a very avid sportsman. He loved to fish and hunt, and that's actually where he met some of his friends, and some of his coworkers would go hunting and fishing with him. It was his passion, according to his late wife.
And so he lived on this property with his wife and his mother-in-law, or just his wife?
That's correct, yes, sir.
Okay, and so he lives on this property almost, I sort of likened it as like a lighthouse keeper. Like he lived there and sort of kept the area, as you said, like he maintained it, and that was his job. Yeah,
I think they had a ton of type maintenance equipment, and which was a fenced-in area. So obviously during the workday, the workers would have to come in and get the whether it be the backhoes or the just maintenance equipment that they had to do for the day, chainsaws, any type of thing like that. It would be housed over there in that area.
So Corporal Nutting. So then tell me, who is Ronald Kate?
Well, Ronnie and John were friends. All the families were friends. Ronnie Cates and his wife, they had two daughters. And Jon Stagner and his wife were really close. They helped the family out. They provided them with some money whenever they needed it. They were very, very generous to the Cates family. And they definitely took them under their wing and helped them out when times were tough. And their generosity was highly commendable.
And do you know, did they live near each other, or did they live far apart?
Yes, they lived near each other. They both lived on the east side. This maintenance facility where Stagner lived, he was, like you said, like a vandal watcher on the property. And that building no longer exists where he lived. It was a house on the property on Forsyth Road. And Ron Cates would come over and visit Stagner quite a bit, and the families interacted with each other a lot. And I would fair to say that the daughters at least felt that John was one of Ronnie's closest friends.
And John was a little older. He was in his 50s, and I think at the time in 1992, Ronald was in his 30s.
Right, John was 53 years old at the time of his death, and how old was?
Cates was probably in his mid-30s.
Okay, all right. So let's get to that. So August 10th, 1992, which is almost, just a little bit past 30 years ago from when we're recording this podcast today, and we actually made the announcement on the cold case, the solving of the cold case on August 10th, 2022. So it was like 30 years to the day.
Yes.
So let's go back to August 10th. Tell me what happened. Tell me, sort of lead me through that day and what happened that you know of.
Yeah. So obviously, like we said, his wife, meaning Stagner's wife, her name was Dolly. She woke up that morning. She remembered, and when she was interviewed by the detective, she remembered that Johnny had a call out the night before. So he got called out in the middle of a rainstorm. There was a tree down, like we said before, and he cleared it, came back home. She recalled that he went to bed. She went to bed, actually, and then he was still up watching TV. She gave us information about, like, he normally would lock this door. He was pretty good about keeping the house secure. Mm-hmm. So basically, she woke up in the morning about almost 5 o'clock in the morning. They slept in separate rooms just because Stagner liked to have just regular cool air or open window type air, where she liked the AC. So they had little differences with that, So she went into the other bedroom, found him. It was dark at the time, and he was just not responsive, and he was cold to the touch. But he had head trauma, to his head. She immediately, tried to call 911, try to get some help there.
So after she calls 911, I assume either the fire department or the Orange County Sheriff's Office deputies come out there. Is that correct?
That's correct, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. So he was not transported to the hospital. The death was obvious. So he remained at the scene, and obviously the detectives and forensics people responded to the scene, documented the crime scene, began their interviews with witnesses. Detectives and the forensics people did a phenomenal job at the scene, documenting it photographically with video, countless interviews with friends and associates of John.
So I without getting into too much graphic detail, can you describe the scene a little bit and what it looked like? Or was there a struggle? Was there stuff everywhere? Or
no, it looks like he just was attacked while he was sleeping. Mm-hmm. It was just as brutal as you could imagine somebody getting bludgeoned to death. It was a pretty gruesome scene. And
we know that because, as you said, we have photographs and I believe there's video too, which I'm sure helps the case now going forward 30 years. This evidence is still here, and we still have it.
Absolutely. That and kind of rolling into what cold cases, how we work them. Certainly, the preservation of the evidence is key. And the 1990s was a period where DNA was in its infancy. Mm-hmm. So the crime scene people were cognizant of the value of DNA, but they just didn't really have the means to process it like we do today. So they would end up being aware, and they would. So a lot of our 1990s evidence is packaged very, very well.
Mm-hmm. And you say packaged very well. We still have it. A lot of the evidence, especially from homicides, at our warehouse. We have a warehouse here at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and when it comes to homicides, we keep that until they're solved.
Absolutely, and over the decades, dating back to the 1940s, we still have the evidence. There's been a lot of transition over the decades, as you can imagine, and not only the Orange County Sheriff's Office, but in law enforcement, and moves of evidence from one facility to the other. And some evidence has to be stored in different manners than others. Some has to be refrigerated. Some has to be kept dry. Some, make sure they're packaged separately. And obviously in the 1970s, 60s, and somewhat in the 80s, the considerations that we have now weren't particularly important, obviously, because look at the 1970s, for example. What they could do is blood type the evidence, so we could tell what type of blood the offender had. That was pretty basic, and the FBI generally did that. So that was where they were back in the 70s, and of course we progressed to where we are today. And who knows where we're going to be in another 20, 30 years. But that's why it's so important to evidence preservation, and that's one of the first things we look at when we open up a cold case is what's the status of our evidence, what condition is it in. We would do a forensic review with our forensic biologists and forensic team to see what kind of a plan of action with the evidence.
So let's get back to this case. So Detective Wilson, what happens next? So John Stagner, he's killed. He's in his bed. He's killed. As you said, very bloody, very gruesome. What happens next? Do I assume detectives start asking around, trying to figure out what happened?
Yeah, the detectives are asking around to friends of Stagner, obviously his wife, his mother-in-law, a lot of the co-workers, obviously. So this happened, on a Monday, or he was found on a Monday, about 5 a.m. But obviously, people are going to start showing up to work, and they start asking around. Has he had any problems, issues with anybody in the past, or which obviously led them to bring up Ronald Cates as a. That he's had issues with him, that Stagner would let him borrow, say, tools or money, things like that. Like Detective Corporal Nutting said, he was like a father figure to Ronald Cates, and he kind of brought him along and helped him out because the Cates family at one point was homeless. They helped him maybe find a place to stay, get money, for food. And his wife was working 2 jobs at the time, just doing the best she could. So they go out and try to interview Mr. Cates, probably on the 11th, I believe. And so at that point, they knock on the door, the 2 detectives do, and one of his daughters is visibly shaken. You can just tell something's, the way they described it to me.
And she's young. She's like in her 12, 11, 10. She's young.
At the time, she was 13, yes.
Okay.
And so then she says, my dad's not home, and they could kind of tell something was wrong, ask a couple more questions, and then they ended up leaving. Kind of watched the house for a little bit because they were kind of, thinking, okay, something's not right here. They watched it for a little bit longer. They had to go down the street to make a phone call, come right back, and then they find out that one of the trucks was driven away. So they go back and make approach again and knock on the door, and the daughter was like, well, yeah, he was here. He just left. He told me to lie for him. So they figured definitely they needed to talk to Cates because he's hiding something,
And so eventually I assume they talked to him. What did they learn from him?
Well, their suspicions were continued throughout the investigation. His behavior was really strange. They had testimony from his family documenting his behavior. They had testimony from some coworkers that saw him earlier in the morning at a local store, and then he was acting strangely. And their initial assessment certainly zeroed in on Cates as the person of interest.
And you mentioned these tools. He was borrowing these tools. Was he pawning them? Was he selling them? Like, what was he doing with these tools?
Yeah, so he was getting the tools from Stagner and would pawn a couple of them. There were times, yes, I think he was giving them back, or he was paying money back to him to Stagner. But then again, I think it became a continued. He's not returning these things. He'd get money for them, and what we later found out to believe was that he had a drug habit, and he was probably using that money obviously to pay for his drugs. And we spoke to Kathy, his wife, obviously in this current times, and she kind of highlighted things that made us believe that she was the only breadwinner of the family at the time, because he used to work with Stagner a long time ago, but then once this murder happened, and before the murder happened a little bit, he obviously got out of working and just decided to just be at home, do nothing, and just get drugs. So
if I'm not mistaken, there was something to do with some bloody clothes and maybe a walking stick. Tell me about this.
So this case went cold, obviously, because despite the evidence that they had, Cates was a frequent visitor inside the home of the Stagners. So you look at the probative value of the evidence. So would you expect fingerprints and DNA to be inside a house? Of course, he's a friend. He's a frequent guest. So that probative value of that evidence. When I say probative, I mean the value. Like,
if I go over there 100 times, you can't say, well, I mean, my fingerprints are going to be all over it because, like you said, I'm a friend.
So that's problematic in terms of evidence. So versus, say, a stranger comes in and he finds a stranger's fingerprints or DNA inside the house, then that's obviously a much more valuable piece of evidence. So in this case, despite their suspicions and his odd behavior and the behavior documented by coworkers and family and the history and the drug use, they just could not develop enough probable cause to make the arrest. I think they might have even discussed it with the prosecutor at some point in the 90s, and the prosecutors just were like, "Oh, you're close, but you're just not there." So the case, the detectives move on. The case gets shelved, and a few years ago, the family decides that they really want to come forward and help.
Before we get there, something happened in 1995. Talk about that.
So he was committed or Baker acted, or some type of mental health evaluation took place, and he confessed to murdering Stagner during that process. But he also made some other outlandish comments about murdering historical figures, and so they were like, well, it's not really sure, again, how probative.
Yeah, if somebody's having a mental breakdown and they start confessing to murders, you really can't use that as evidence. I mean, you might be able to, but...
Right, I mean, it is certainly important, especially when they describe or they talk about things that only the killer would know. So again, he was still the prime suspect, but they still couldn't. The state wasn't comfortable taking what they had in front of a jury.
Okay.
So then so that was 95, Kevin. Yeah.
Yes.
So they the case probably from that point on, just because that was only 3 years after the murder, so a lot of the people that were in homicide, a lot of detectives were familiar with the case. Obviously, it was a case a lot of people knew about back then. A county worker getting murdered on county property is certainly something that would resonate or would stick with the detectives and the supervisors and management here.
Yeah.
The sheriff's office. So they just, despite how much you want to solve it, it just wasn't in the cards at that point.
So at some point, Ronald and his family, they move away, though, because they leave Florida.
Correct. And they end up, ultimately residing in North Carolina. I'm not sure, Kevin, where they left, or between Orlando and North Carolina.
It was probably in the early 2000s, I believe. So he had a couple other, brushes with the law, things like that, before they end up moved up to pretty much the Charlotte area. And then at that point, his daughters got to the point where they were getting, adults and moving on and starting to live their own lives and move on to other areas.
Okay. So then fast forward to, I believe it's 2020, March 2020, and something happens. Tell me what happens in March 2020.
So we were in cold case at the time,
and the cold case unit team has been going on for several years, sort of revamped in the last few years.
Right. So in 2020, I came over as a supervisor to the cold case team. That was a newly funded position. And for a few months, Kevin and I just worked by ourselves, and then we've added two other detectives in the meantime. Sort
of looking at old cases, and I'm sure there's some that are closer to maybe being solved than other ones, just based on evidence.
Absolutely, and to give credit to our predecessors, because the sheriff's office has been working cold cases for a long time. So our predecessors have really helped organize the files and have a pretty good process for us to step into. So the learning curve for Kevin and I was to get in there and try and figure out the best practices moving forward.
Okay.
And so this lead came in through the family, and
through Ronald Cates' family.
Correct. Yeah. Correct. So we, having additional testimony from family members who recalled what happened that day rather vividly, and then explaining how this event carried on through their family history over the next essentially 30 years was really the what pushed the case over the hump.
So what can you tell us? Because I should have mentioned this at the beginning. There might be some certain details that we can't get into because this case is still going on. I mean he has been arrested, Ronald Cates, but there hasn't been a trial or anything like that yet. So there might be some things we can't get into. But what did you learn in 2020?
So actually in 2020, so there was another cold case detective that was with us, Gina Adams. She got the case. She was notified through another homicide detective. Like I said, Cates' family members contacted us, got a hold of this other detective, and then Gina got a hold of it. She started really talking to one of the daughters, got good, extensive interview of family dynamics, I would say, what their history was like, who was a part of this family, who was living where at the time. And so some of the stuff she learned was that there were things uncharacteristic that they would basically do as a child, as a 10 or 12-year-old little girl or something like that with their dad. Mm-hmm. And that they were vividly remember things like burning clothes on a tree stump. It's kind of weird, but then again, you're thinking yourself, when you put it two and two together and you're thinking, well, these same clothes were given to me by my dad to hide under the house. This was just after, say, detectives, were here to talk to us about one of our friends' deaths. Mm-hmm. So it was just things like that, and those small little details that we kind of tallied up over time kind of helped us more or less help with that timeline of what possibly could have happened. And 2020 happened, 2021, we continued to look into it. Actually, us as detectives, that same detective, Detective Adams, was able to send like a recorder, to one of the family members so they could basically record the conversations they had with their dad, their mom, and I think that got him a little bit more thinking about the case, thinking about maybe what he had done in the past. And actually his wife was even saying like, well, it's weird. He always gets a little bit like he wants to talk about it a whole lot more in April and August. April was when Stagner, his birthday month was, and then August is when this happened. So it was one of those, we need to keep pushing this because we know something's going to happen. Something's going to help break the case.
Mm-hmm. And so what broke the case? What happened?
Well, so part of the process that we've developed here in the cold case team is we work very closely with the prosecutor's office, the state attorney's office. So cold cases are run through a single point of contact at the state attorney's office. And those cases are reviewed for prosecutorial input. Although they can't tell us yes or no, they certainly work with us to say, hey, what could make this case better? Mm-hmm. So sometimes the cases will go before a grand jury, and sometimes we'll get an arrest warrant. And it's almost always in concurrence with the state attorney's office. So this case was written up. Kevin got all the facts together, wrote it up, and sent it over to the prosecutor to review. Prosecutor reviewed the case, had some questions. Questions were addressed to the point, to their satisfaction. We know that we're going to make the arrest and this case is going to be filed. Because just making the arrest doesn't mean the case is going to be prosecuted. Unfortunately, some facts change, witnesses issues come up, and between the arrest and trial, things can go sideways for any number of reasons. But having that prosecutorial concurrence in the beginning and prosecutorial review of the case is certainly one of the largest factors that we have in terms of our success with the state attorney's office, and not only making these arrests, but leading to a successful conclusion. And I will mention that we just did get our first conviction on another one of Kevin's cases that he had in cold case, and the young man was sentenced to life in prison based on Kevin's hard work. And
that sort of shows like we don't give up on these cases here at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. We try to work as many as we can.
Right. So the as close as they were back in the 90s, undoubtedly the information provided by the family of Ronnie Cates helped push this case over over the line.
But even then, you didn't arrest him right away, or we didn't arrest him right away. Something still had to happen earlier this year, correct?
Yes. So yeah, we got notified by actually some authorities, the Salisbury Police Department up in North Carolina in April of this year, 22, and they said that he was involuntary committed, and at the hospital, and that he made some statements to, a nurse, and then that nurse kind of looked at that as like, well, maybe someone should look into this. A security guard came over and listened to what he was saying. And what he was saying was like, I killed somebody in Orange County back in 1992. And he said it was John Stagner. And so the security guard had, obviously pulled out his phone and started researching Orange County Sheriff's Office. And we keep a list of all of our cold cases on our website.
And they go back, as you said, I think to the 1940s.
1941, so it gives a brief description of it, the name, the dates, the year. So it's kind of like, well, the security guard was like, well, let's call the police department over here because they might want to talk to him. And these two patrol guys came over, talked to him for about 10 or 12 minutes. And what was interesting about the case was even that they kind of made sure, hey, listen, we're not here to do anything to you or whatever. He was like, no. He was telling them, put your body cam on. I want to tell you about this. So it was, I think he felt at ease enough to tell them what he was probably holding in for 30 years or so,
And so as you said, he talked to this officer from the Salisbury Police Department. It's on his body cam. What happens then? I mean, do the Salisbury police contact us and say, look, we got this guy and we think he might have committed this murder. Come on up and talk to him, or what happens next?
They contacted us and told us, obviously it's a little bit of they don't know a ton about our case, obviously, and we do. So then we try to go up there and talk to him, and complete opposite. He doesn't want to have anything to do with us. A week later, we go up there. So we are able to pitch this to our bureau chief for the homicide with the state attorney's office, and she's feeling very, very confident about that. I mean, she knew about the 1995 statements. She knew about this one and all the timeline extra information that the family was providing. And what was interesting about the hospital confession in April 22, his wife was contacting me once he was going in and out of the hospital a little bit. And this was when she was telling me about, hey, it's coming up to be in April. He's starting to think about it a whole lot more. I'm feeling more confident to talk to you about things, meaning, about the case, because he's not in the house. I mean, she lived in fear for this guy for a long time.
And they're still married, correct?
They're still married, and obviously the kids are out of the house, but she's still in the house. So we were concerned, obviously, with her still being in the house. When would we possibly arrest this guy? Would she be around? And, safety reasons, you know what I mean?
So that happens in April. He was eventually arrested, I believe, in August. Like, what happened between April and August, and what finally led to his arrest?
So obviously in evidence review, like in all these cases, we make sure the forensics department did an amazing job with this case. I mean, this happened. They found his body on the 10th. They kept the crime scene till about the 18th, I believe. They kept these crime scenes for like 10 or so days, sometimes 8-10 days, just to process a lot of stuff, and they to make sure that they're getting every piece of evidence that they really need. So we went back and looked, obviously knowing that he was possibly struck with some type of club or an object. We were able to see in evidence that they had a stick wrapped up and preserved. The family always described that he had a walking stick that he would walk with.
And this
all
is
the time.
Ronald. Ronald had
yes,
a walking stick.
Yes. They described it as, about maybe 3 to 4 foot long, had electrical tape on one end of it. And lo and behold, we actually, found that the CSIs took one and packaged it up and preserved it. On the 10th or 11th, actually, while they were processing the scene. So we tried to do some DNA testing on that. We recently, there just wasn't enough DNA on the stick, it seems. But that stick was actually identified by the family members as being, they felt was very, very strongly that was one of the sticks that Ronald would walk around with, if not the stick.
And we still have that stick.
Yes, we
in
do.
evidence.
Yes.
Is that what they think Ronald may have used? Or is that what you think Ronald may have used to kill John Stagner?
Well, the lack of DNA on the stick would probably say otherwise. But what's interesting about that particular stick is that if it is in fact a stick that the family recognizes as one that he would carry with him, is left at the scene, then that's kind of interesting that the stick could have been, he could have left it in his panic to leave or something dropped it.
And also that the family said, he made statements to the family and said, never talk about that stick. I threw it away. I don't need it anymore. So those types of things tied into us finding it at the crime scene were pretty huge for us, I thought.
So there's bloody clothes that were burned. There's this walking stick that was possibly or was left at the scene. So all these things sort of together are what make it so you can make an arrest of Ronald Cates.
Right. I mean, sometimes you hear the phrase, nothing is everything, but everything is something. So there was no proverbial smoking gun in this case. There was nothing overly dramatic, but it was the culmination of several pieces of information: physical evidence, eyewitness evidence, family evidence, his own words, that all culminated in all these pieces coming together to complete the puzzle.
And his own family. I mean, this was mentioned when we did our press event. One of our local reporters asked this question: is it rare that a family member sort of gets involved and says, look, I think my dad might have done this, or we want to help you solve this case? Is that a rarity?
It's a first for me, but it's we'll take what we can get. But it is a first for me. But I think a lot of people do live with the guilt of knowing about a murder or having committed a murder. In some ways, it's a therapeutic way for them to get these things off their chest and to live their life knowing that they've done something good.
I've also learned this from you two. I mean, a lot of things can change in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. And so, relationships change, and maybe somebody you liked 35 years ago, you might not like them anymore. Not to say this is the case here, but also I'm sure memories sort of come back to people, especially if there's two sisters or two siblings. One might say, oh, I remember this. Well, I remember that too. And just how memory works sometimes. And you start talking to somebody and say, yeah, I remember that night too. And I remember this, and this. And it can just sort of help sort of trigger what happened.
Yeah. And I think with this particular family, from what everything I've talked to the Cates family about, and the way they came forward and tried to continue to push this, I feel like they knew right from wrong, and they felt that, regardless of he's my dad, he's my husband, whatever the case may be, they felt that they didn't want us to give up on it, and we were very glad that obviously they didn't give up on it, and they were willing to give their open and honest testimony, basically, of what they remember, what they saw. And it was I've actually talked to the Stagner family several times, obviously, after a lot of this has happened, and they are just beside themselves of how happy they can be, with the Cates family too, because there's no ill will, obviously, between the two of them at all. I've actually spoken to Stagner's his niece, who actually, she said he walked her down the aisle, almost like a father figure for her. So it was a big, good piece of news that the Cates family came forward, and there's some type of resolution, to this.
And I think we didn't mention this at the beginning, but I don't think Jon Stagner and his wife, they didn't have any kids, correct?
Correct. Not together. His wife had a son from a previous marriage,
okay.
But together they did not.
But I believe he has at least one sister, Jon Stagner.
Yes,
I know that because she had commented on some of our stuff on Facebook when we put this up on there.
Right.
Very relieved that this case was hopefully solved.
Right, and I believe also I was watching some of those comments, John. I believe a coworker of Stagner's at the time. I think it was Aaron Rubens. He commented, and he was in the original case file too. And so it was when you it's good to know that a lot of these people, like their supervisors or their friends at the time, they can feel that that justice was served.
So where is Ronald Cates right now? Is he still in jail up in North Carolina? Is he coming back here to Florida? Like, what's sort of the next steps?
Well, he is going to come back here. He's actually already waived extradition, so he is coming back here very soon. It just depends on when our extraditions team can go up there and get him, and he'll be able to. Whether he pleads, guilty or not guilty, and then we start the trial process, and we'll see what happens.
So is it just sort of like a holding pattern right now? Do you just sort of wait till what's next?
Yeah, we just see waiting and see what's next. He's. I feel like when we did go up there to talk to him once he was arrested, he did have a lot to think about, and that's what he even told me. He said I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't reach out and try to give some type of a version, but we'll see.
I mean, it's a pretty incredible story, because I know every cold case is different, and obviously this one was different as well. They don't all get solved like this, but like you said earlier, Corporal Nutting, you take what you can get.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't choose your victims. You can't choose your witnesses. Time is an enemy and an ally in these cases. Witnesses die. Witnesses just disappear. Witnesses come forward after many years. Their life circumstances change. Sometimes they move out of town and they feel more comfortable, and they have information. A lot of our reviews are figuring out where the witnesses are now and then re-engaging those witnesses that may not have wanted to come forward back then, and they just need a little extra encouragement by some detective showing up at their door to relive what happened years and years ago.
And so, this one is solved, but there's still hundreds more that need to be solved as well. And so you got a lot of work ahead of you.
Yeah, we really do. We have a lot of work. So unfortunately, there are a lot of unsolved cases, but fortunately we have 4 of us back there that are working on it, putting a lot of hours in, a lot of effort, and we have a lot of experience. So the residents of Orange County can know that these murder victims will not be forgotten. Yeah,
we don't quit. I mean, 30 years is a long time, and I'm sure a lot of people, family members, friends, like you said, coworkers, I'm sure after, so many years they say, we may have known who did it, but it's probably never going to be solved, or nobody's ever going to get arrested. But, you never know. 30 years is a long time, but it can happen.
Yeah, I would certainly encourage anybody that, even if they think their information is not particularly relevant, it might have heard somebody talking about something, but we can put all those pieces together and make a case. Sometimes, like in this particular case, we just needed a couple more witnesses to come forward to really push it over the top. I mean, that's all we needed. It could be. I would certainly encourage anybody to come forward.
And if somebody has information, I believe it's OCSO cold case at ocfl.net. Is that the best way to reach you?
Yep. Or they can call Crime Line, do that as well. They can call the non-emergency number. They'll put them in touch with me or one of the other detectives, and we'll definitely get back with them. There's any number of ways. Our social media has a great presence. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, we see the messages come in. If it's something like that, we will definitely get you the information. All right. Well, Corporal Nutting, Detective Wilson, congratulations on solving this case. I mean, it's a huge deal, like I said, for the family members and for friends and coworkers. But like I said, you got a lot of work to do. So I'm going to let you guys go, and we'll see you guys next time on Behind the Star.
All right. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Behind the Star. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Also, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, I'm Jon Busdeker, and this is Behind the Star.